But I know that we would like to have some discussion. This is Washington, and our audience is both online and in the room. And I'd like to be able to take 2 or 3 rounds of discussion if we can, and begin with the room. And for the online audience, please convey your questions and comments through the various platforms, and we'll come to that in the second round. Those of you who'd like to make any comments, please give me a show of hands, and we will have mics coming around. And we will begin, as always, with John Conrad. Please have a mic come up to John here. And please introduce your name and your institution, and then the gentleman next to you, and then I'll come this way. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm John Conrad with the Hunger Project, and we're active in the Cox's Bazar area and across Bangladesh. And my question really has to do with what, there's a big difference in the economic structure of Jordan and Bangladesh. So I'm wondering 2 questions about possibilities for enhanced employment for both host and refugee communities. What kinds of investments would actually make a difference in the Cox's Bazar area? And what kind of logistical transformation would be required for refugees to work in the broader Chittagong region? Because, you know, that's not an easy commute. And so those are my 2 questions, and anybody with a sense of it can answer.
Thank you. Please pass the mic.
Good afternoon. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the illustrious Howard University here in Washington. Mr. Hodnott, you mentioned that you recently worked with the poorest people in the world that you've ever worked with thus far. Could you be specific as to where exactly on the planet those people are located? And could you expound on the uniqueness that those people have as opposed to other people around the world that you've met and worked with? In terms of their culture and just who they are. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Katrina?
Thank you. Katrina Kosick, IFPRI. My question is related to what are the sort of social networks that these refugees, displaced persons have that they could take advantage of? If we're talking about labor market opportunities that are in the camp versus a little bit more distant versus further away, those would seem to be really important, and also just informal sources of support they might receive. So I'm wondering if we could hear a little about that, and if there's anything that you think that has important implications for strategies of trying to thrive in this type of a difficult setting.
Thank you very much. Let me take 2 more hands at the back there, Mary. Nick and I cannot see who the other one is.
Okay. Yeah, sure. It's a question for Paul. Not the one you're expecting. It's on? Oh, sorry. Nick Mine from Markets, Trade and Institutions at IFPRI. So the question is about the results related to the reduction in wages. You were saying that if you expand the area, the reduction is less. At the same time, it's affecting more people. So it's, may not be, I'm assuming that when you say the impact is less, you're talking about the percentage wage reduction, but it is going to affect a larger population. Do you think that, it sounds like a good trade-off to me, but from the perspective of the government, that might be questionable? Just a comment.
Thank you very much. And one last hand at the back.
Hi there, I'm Timothy Swenger, recent PhD in religious studies from ASU, and I have a question for Cindy specifically, but anyone who feels qualified, I'd love to hear your answer. It's about the political will in Myanmar towards repatriation. As I understand, it's quite dismal at the moment. In Rakhine State and on a national level, most people are against it. At the very least, there's no incentive for it. So do you foresee any change in that due to international pressure for other factors after the 2020 elections? And how does that intersect with pressure to leave, if any, from the Bangladeshi government? As I understand, officially, the Rohingya are still refugees. There is little will for permanent settlement there, although I, of course, may be incorrect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have panelists. We have 5 questions from here. We also have comments from Cindy and Ruth. So I'd like to encourage you, be brief in your responses. Pick what you can so we can take the online audience next. Paul, shall we begin with you or John first? Okay. Paul, the mic is right there.
John, I will consider that a gracious response. Yeah, those were some excellent questions. Let me start with what Nick had mentioned. We're measuring the percentage change in the wage rate. And so if you have the other investments and these people are integrated into the broader Chittagong labor market, the percentage change in the wage rate is 0. So that adverse effect is spread out, or that null effect is spread out across the whole region. But your broad point is noted for the other simulations. On the social networks, there are some connections that are there. And what's important to realize is the very first oldest refugees are actually refugees. Roughly 50,000 people have been in Bangladesh for about 20 years. And those first 50,000 were granted recognition as refugees. This other group, 950,000, almost all of them are not officially refugees. They don't have legal status in the country. Not only that, the government of Bangladesh is not required by treaty to keep them. So that's why they've been called, or part of the reasons why they're called forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals and not refugees. So that's a big part of it, but maybe there are some social networks through those 50,000 who have been in Bangladesh for a while, or even subsequent waves. Those people have, to some extent, worked outside the camp, especially the original 50,000. Most of these people in our survey that are working, they're working inside the camp. They're working in small shops. They're doing construction. They have small services. There's not widespread sneaking out of the camp. And so that's not what we found. We did not find that in the survey. And then what else could these people do? Well, it was mentioned that there are logistical issues. One could imagine, possibly, massive road construction to improve the infrastructure going from the camp to this place, Cox's Bazar, and then on to Chittagong. So that's one possibility. The other thing is conceivably some textile production and exports if there were investment. And I'll stop there.
So I'm just going to pick up on 2 questions, which is the question about the poorest people in the world and a little bit more about the question about social networks and potential sources of income. So when I was talking about the poorest people in the world, I'm actually talking about this population. I think I've done field work in 10 or 12 different developing countries. I've done field work in 10 or 12 different developing countries. Easily, by far, these are the poorest people I've ever worked with. And to kind of give you 2 vignettes to drive this home, the global international poverty line is roughly $2 per person per day. The average person in this population lives on a third of that. A second vignette is when we've gone out and done field visits and you go and talk with people and you get invited into their homes. You go into a dwelling which is a single room and there is nothing there. No furniture, no wardrobes, maybe 1 or 2 cooking pots. These are extraordinarily poor people, which is why questions like the social networks are actually useful ones to explore. We know in other contexts those can be powerful mechanisms for improving people's well-being. Unfortunately, the data we have in this case suggests that those are only going to be of limited value. And both the words limited and value are important here. We know there's a very small proportion of our sample, and we suspect of the broader population, who are able to access those networks, are now able, for example, to receive some remittance income, but they are definitely in the minority. Social networks, as we know, can be important for employment, but as Paul and Dr. Yunus have indicated, because of these very strong legal prohibitions, particularly on this population working outside the camps, there's very little opportunity or scope to take advantage of those.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the first question on you know, how would this happen? How would we integrate the Rohingya that are currently in camps into the broader economy of Chittagong? And I was very interested to understand a little bit more about how this had been modeled, so that we could try and think about, well, what kind of policy solutions might get us there. Is this being modeled as commuting, people staying in the camps and traveling and coming back, or is this being modeled as people being allowed to move? And so I think actually going into the nitty-gritty of the model a little bit more could help us understand sort of how we might get there. I also wanted to throw a little bit of a note of caution as well, in that we've just completing the Bangladesh poverty assessment, and Chittagong is the one place where poverty has increased quite substantially actually in the last few years, and we don't have a good understanding of why that is, but some people are saying, well, this is because we've had a lot of Rohingya moving into the area lately and affecting ability to work. But actually we also know that a lot of this is about the inability of Chittagong to stay productive, to have good textile companies locating there and so on. So I think actually getting into, well, what are the policy requirements needed for there to be some economic growth in this area that could be a good source of employment for the Rohingya would be really good. And then also I think just it was actually really fascinating for me to hear a little bit more of a description about what people are currently doing to earn income. And I think those are some great stories to get out there, because it shows the level of ingenuity and entrepreneurship that exists even in the most harsh settings. And it helps us understand how actually spreading that entrepreneurship and ingenuity and drive a little bit broader beyond the camps can have some beneficial effects, and that it's not all a negative story.
Thank you. Cindy?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on Ruth's point, because I think there have been really interesting studies, including those done by the World Bank and IFC, for example, in Kenya, the Yes in My Backyard study, which showed the amount of economic activity that has been driven, partly that's from the aid dollars that are coming in, but also because building on the ingenuity of the people there. So I think that's, again, I don't know to what extent that was included in the model, but kind of thinking through some of those questions would be really helpful. So to John's question, and he knows I'm an optimist, so this may be an optimistic response, but looking at kind of the rates of growth that Bangladesh has been able to sustain compared with a country like Jordan, yes, the structures of the economy are very different, and Cox's Bazar is a kind of what's called a lagging district in the country, but I think that there is kind of the country has demonstrated through, the creation of special economic zones, et cetera, that, targeted effort can yield results. So I would say that drives some of my optimism. That being said, there are reasons why Cox's Bazar is a lagging district, and those will not be improved overnight. And I think that it will take attention. I mean, infrastructure investments, I think, are a good opportunity, and that's where the engagement of some of the multilateral development banks, not just the World Bank, but the AIB or ADB, could be really helpful. And then secondly, we are planning to do a paper in the next 2 months that talks about specific investment opportunities and some of the initial ideas around the shrimp and fisheries industry. There's some hope around tourism, though that's not quite as confirmed. And then there's also a deep sea port that's going in the district at Matabari. Now, again, one thing that I wanted to emphasize is that I do not see there being a lot of promise in a kind of a big bang approach, where you suddenly integrate or even include a significant large number of refugees at the same time. I really think it's it would be right to be incremental, and I think we should look at all the various policy options. As you may know from the Jordan experience, there was a promise of giving around 200,000 work permits, but that ceiling has never even been met because there are various barriers. So, I really think some experimentation, a way both to deliver and message those win-wins is really important. And then just very quickly on the question of political will, I think we would all agree that there's very low to zero political will currently in Myanmar to create the conditions for safe, dignified, and voluntary return. I think I would not pretend to have a crystal ball about this. What I think is so important is that the international community keep up the pressure through multiple channels and to continue focusing on the Advisory Commission's report, because I think it's quite fair for the government and others to feel some pressure to do more for refugees and hosts while looking across the border and potentially not seeing as much pressure going on there. So I think it's really important to have a balanced effort and at the same time to address the reality that we're in today.
Thank you, Cindy. Paul, did you want to reflect back on some of the comments that have been raised before I go back to the audience?
Yes, thank you. I'll come back quickly on that. One is in the modeling that's done, are we talking about people leaving the camps, or where are they going? So some of those simulations were for the scenario where people are only able to work within the immediate vicinity of the camp. In that case, one could imagine it would be feasible for them to have to return every day. The broader scenario where people are, we have a situation where there is no negative effect on the real wage, that's requiring people to work in Chittagong, closer to that big city, and that's several hours commute each way. That's not really feasible. So that is a situation where implicitly in the model that would mean that people are free to move further afield from the camps themselves. There's also this question of has the influx of the Rohingya somehow increased poverty in Chittagong? And I think that's rather doubtful, because there aren't a lot of Rohingya that have actually successfully left the camps and flooded a labor market. As we said, if they did flood the labor market in the Cox's Bazar area, the immediate vicinity of the camp, that would be serious. But our household survey and the other data that we have suggests that there hasn't been that much of a exit from the camps to do that kind of work. And then finally, a big difference between this situation and the situation in other countries is that there's no land available, right? So if you think about some of the stories you may have heard from Kenya or Uganda or other places, well, there's this opportunity to farm. And in this little sliver of Bangladesh, and I mistakenly flipped right past the map at the start of this seminar, but in this little sliver of Bangladesh, there is essentially no land that these people could farm. And so there isn't this complementary factor of production that would help.
Thank you very much. This is a very rich discussion, and I know we want to continue, but let me pick up the online questions first. My colleague Lucy can read them out.
Okay, thank you. So there are two questions here. This is from Dan Norrell from World Vision USA in DC, and the question is for Ruth. What are the opportunities for FDMN persons to be self-employed to provide goods and services both inside and outside the camps? And the second one is Heather Tallis from the Nature Conservancy, Michigan, USA. Can Cindy comment on how reforestation might contribute to employment or nutrition? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me come back to the room and see if there are any further questions or comments over here. And let me begin on this side of the room and then come here. Mary, if you could give the mic with the gentleman there and then come to the front.
Raphael with the REACH initiative. Just very quickly on the question regarding the potential employment opportunities within the camps, besides what everyone in the front mentioned, I know that they also, well, besides working as volunteer teachers at the learning centers within the camps, they also provide informal education to Rohingya, and some of them do get paid to provide informal education. They're not supposed to. I've gotten in contact with some of these groups that do provide this education. They take they acquire a copy of the formal Myanmar or Bangladeshi curriculum, and they teach it themselves at their own households or at the households of whoever they're teaching. As well, within the camp with the humanitarian effort, they work with some organizations to not work in the roads, but they work to build pathways within the camps. So when you're walking the camps, you'll actually see that there are Rohingya that are actually building the roads. So there are some cash for work opportunities that are available there. So I have two main questions, and the first one goes about the reintegration with the host community. Back in February, the host community has started having protests against the humanitarian community and the Rohingya in regards to them with complaints that the humanitarian organizations weren't hiring host community. And when they say host community, they don't mean Bangladeshis, they mean internationals and Bangladeshis from Dhaka as well. So not hiring the local Chittagonians. So how do you think that would impact into the reintegration of Rohingya getting employment opportunities? As well, besides ongoing talks of repatriation to Myanmar, there are also ongoing talks, nothing verified, but these are ongoing talks across the Rohingya communities that they will be relocated from within Bangladesh to a small island. Understood that and agreed that this is kind of a movement from a humanitarian to a development effort, but how would these rumors, albeit of relocation to different areas, affect any potential opportunities for entrepreneurship within this region?
Thank you very much. Let me ask the mic to come to Nurul Islam in the front row, and then to the gentleman next to him.
As a Rohingya myself, I may ask a question which is not quite relevant to all these technical details, but a broader question. Firstly, I have no idea whether you have any idea of the amount of money spent, committed and spent by all the agencies, international agencies, so far in Bangladesh. Two, what is the amount of grant or loans given to Bangladesh government itself to spend on these refugees? It seems to be a completely dark area. I have tried my best to get data. I couldn't get anything. I have got some data from the UNHCR, only for those which are coordinated by UNHCR, not other agencies which provide directly. So we are completely in dark about this, even though I'm writing very complicated papers for the donors' activities, right? Are they interested? We don't have a ghost of an idea. And what are they doing today? We don't have a ghost of an idea. Either amount or the kind of activities. Maybe we have, but we haven't told in the papers. Secondly, the social network question is a very serious one. Rohingyas are ethnically, linguistically, radically different from the rest of Bangladesh. I am a Rohingya myself. I know if I speak today, nobody outside of narrow confine of Chittagong will understand my language. So they are very different kind of refugees. It's not like Syrian refugees going to Jordan. That's culturally, linguistically same. It's not true of Rohingya in Bangladesh. Thirdly, Paul conjuncturally remarked that there is a very serious political problem. And ignoring that, it doesn't mean anywhere. If Bangladesh government does not recognize the possibility of absorbing these 1 million, Prime Minister, all right, I'll refer to a very important news item yesterday. I sent it to, I think, Paul. An US congressman has suggested that the Rakhine area should be made independent and handed over to Bangladesh. Prime Minister of Bangladesh vehemently opposed this. He says this is creating a war possibility. So it's not a simple technical analysis of activities in Rohingya area. It's a very serious problem. And of course, we are not competent to do that, but I'm saying these will be all useless under the bigger problem. Bangladesh refuses to possibility of acknowledging them, possibility of absorbing them. The moment this congressman said it, within 5 hours, Prime Minister of Bangladesh said, slammed him, saying this is ridiculous. He's starting a war between Bangladesh and Myanmar. Because somehow Bangladesh government believes that somehow eventually settlement will be made of taking them back. But realistically, they don't believe it. So what I'm suggesting is this thing should be passionate perspective, which is radically different from what we're discussing here. The Rohingyas cannot be sent outside the narrow boundary of the eastern part of Chittagong even. They cannot speak the language, something different. So this kind of, the Syrian refugees can be scattered all over Jordan, all over Arab countries. They're ethnically, linguistically, culturally the same. So it's not just straightforward moral building. I'm sorry to say that. Thank you.
Very much, Nurul. The gentleman next to you.
Just a question that was raised by Professor Hadnot about the housing. And frankly, I don't quite understand. Are these, because I haven't obviously been to the camps, are the people still in blue plastic tents? If not, you built cement structures for 800,000 people, and it didn't have major impacts on the Bangladesh economy? So could you explain a little bit about what's been done about physically housing the people, especially because it does rain occasionally?
Thank you. Panelists, there is a heck of a lot of interest here, and I hope you're able to take notes. I will take the last two, and forgive me for that, but I do want to give our panelists a chance to also respond. I think, Ekin, you have the mic in your hand?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I do. Hello, Ekin Birol, Harvest Plus IFPRI. Firstly, I want to say thank you all so much. Seeing such thoughtful, high quality and actionable research from all your wonderful institutions, it really gives me hope, not just for Rohingyas, but all refugees and displaced people worldwide. So thank you so much. I have two questions. One of them following up on Vu's question on how comparable 2017 and 2018 data are. I was wondering, if I remember correctly, in 2017 there were major floods in Bangladesh. Have you taken that into consideration in your analysis of the two waves? Because that had significant effect on the rice production in the country, if I remember correctly. The second question, also building on what Dr. Islam has said, the comparison with Jordan is super interesting, but I was wondering if you considered comparing with Turkey, currently hosting almost 4 million Syrian refugees, and then there is the issue of language difference and cultural difference as well. So I guess the comparison might have been, I guess, more similar to what's happening in Bangladesh. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ekin. I thought I'd seen a hand right somewhere near you. And if not, please, that's the last question we will take. Thank you.
Thanks. This is Shalini Roy from IFPRI. I wanted to ask if you collected anything on mental health. I think what we hear about the Rohingya is the trauma that they've experienced, and I wondered if you could comment on the implications both for employment. All the ingenuity we talk about kind of implies suitable mental health and aspirations for that, as well as we know that it plays a role for nutrition for children when mothers' mental health is affected. Thanks.
Panelists, such a rich set of questions. We cannot sadly be here for the whole day to answer. May I ask you to be selective in picking up what you can, and then I will give each of you 30 seconds or so towards the end to make your closing remarks. Let me begin again with, this time, John, maybe?
Sir, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to deal directly with the question about the housing and the mental health and bundle some other responses in my closing remarks. On the housing, there's been a lot of effort to try and improve it along two lines, one of which is just getting people out of that really basic, like plastic sheeting, sort of a blue, I think your phrase was blue tent, and getting into people something which is vaguely more permanent. But the phrase vaguely more permanent actually describes it really well. So the vast majority of people in our sample basically live in huts which have bamboo slats and supports with plastic, like thick popeline plastic for the walls and the roofs. There's been a lot of emphasis on trying to raise plinths for exactly the point you make about trying to get people up, at least off some of the worst of the rain. there have been considerable efforts going into the construction of latrines, which is obviously very important for sanitation. So clearly everyone is aware of these concerns. And I think this comes back to Ruth's observation, is that at some level an enormous amount has been done in a short period of time. But that doesn't take away from the fact that basically these conditions are still extraordinarily basic. Shalini's question about mental health was an excellent one, and it's actually one that the team wrestled with for a very long period of time. And we eventually decided not to explore that in this quantitative survey. The reason being is that our strong suspicion is that in fact the mental health of many of these individuals is very poor. Having them relive some of their feelings in the context of a quantitative survey is potentially very problematic in a survey which is already very fragile, in a survey population which is already very fragile. We're also aware is that that may also create significant burdens on our enumerators in terms of actually having to sit with people who are reliving these experiences. What we did instead is we did a smaller qualitative survey where we actually explored a lot of those issues in more depth with a very specially well-trained team who are trained both in terms of eliciting that information in a sympathetic and empathetic way, but also whom had the mental resources to actually absorb it. And it's certainly very clear, I think, to both Paul and I, is that that survey team clearly suffered a lot just in terms of having to listen to these terrible stories over and over again. So I agree with you absolutely that these concerns are really important, not only as metrics or important aspects of these individuals' well-being, but also their instrumental value in terms of people's ability to go out and work, the nutritional status of their children, and so on and so forth. But in a population like this, it's actually really hard to actually implement those types of survey instruments in a way which is sympathetic to the population and a way which is not going to be problematic for the survey team either.
Okay, I'll just focus on this issue of the integration into the labor market. So this Chittagong region that is what we modeled in the integration into the broader economy. This Chittagong region is still this southeast corner of Bangladesh. It's 31 million people. Bangladesh has a lot of folks, right? And so if the Rohingya integrate into that, they are 3% of the labor force. And that's why we don't get this massive effect on the wage rate. And it's also why if you have investment in that part of the country, you could conceivably prevent any decline in the wage. And then in terms of the big political economy questions, that's beyond what certainly our study could handle, and those are really crucial questions, and that's why I'm glad Nurul Islam will answer them. Yeah, okay.
No, I don't have the definitive numbers on the amounts of assistance. I'm sure UNHCR pointed you to the Joint Response Plan and the ISCG, but I think that is a perpetual challenge, and also tracking those disbursements. But I think the JRP last year was 900 million, and so we know a significant number of dollars are going in, but the timeline, et cetera, and the exact tracking of it is unclear. Just to pick a couple of the questions, first, in terms of the opportunities for livelihoods for refugees and hosts in reforestation, I think they're really significant. In the shorter term, there are opportunities potentially for business development around nurseries, which could include cash for work. And then also one idea that we explored is there are some wildlife sanctuaries and other protected areas where there have been an increase in invasive species. So could there be a daily work program where, again, refugees and hosts could weed out some of those invasive species and prepare the land for the longer term planning that the Bangladesh Forestry Department has. And then in the longer term, even though, of course, land is very tight, as Paul mentioned, there are areas in Bangladesh that have been designated for social forestry models, so there would potentially be opportunities for longer-term benefit sharing, either among the host community or, again, refugees and hosts. So I just wanted to comment briefly, actually, on the political economy questions, and again, not say that I have the answers, but one thing that we've found is that it can be helpful sometimes to try to connect these technical issues with the political questions, in the sense that when I talk about some of the responsibility sharing commitments, you know, whether it's labor mobility opportunities or private sector investment, the idea is that there would be something that's substantive enough that would at least enter into some peripheral calculations of how people see the situation. Now, we won't always be able to achieve that, but that's the aspiration. And I will say, in other contexts, not to say that they're exactly the same, you know, in Ethiopia, there is also, anchored by the World Bank, a big $500 million investment in industrial development, and part of that package was investment in infrastructure, investment in industrial zones, and inclusion of some refugees accessing livelihoods opportunities. Turkey, I think we'll have to talk afterwards. It's a longer discussion. I think there have been some studies that have shown that there has been complementarity, partially because of the language differences. Sometimes that adds to the complementarity of the workforces. At the same time, as in all of these situations, there are some winners and some losers. So I think that's an interesting case where Turkey has also opened up the possibility for refugees to access work permits. So I think all of these cases, whether it's Ethiopia, Jordan, Turkey, none of them are perfect, but they have all, to me, shown the way of that connectivity, of some potential for a win-win and inclusive growth play that has helped to, if not dramatically change, shape the policy conversation. And I feel if anything, that's been actually a kind of bright spot in global refugee policy. So those are important to hold on to and try to promote.
So yeah, on the amounts of money, I'm not very good with numbers, but I will get back to you on that, because the World Bank support is to the government. If I were better with numbers, I would remember the total amounts, but it's pretty easy to add up. There's been a number of operations that have been directed to the refugee. So that's support to the government. In terms of humanitarian response, I can't speak to that. But I wanted to come to the point of politics, because this was sort of also something that I'd wanted to mention when I was making my discussant comments. And I think in my mind, this is actually, one option is to say, well, there's no point of doing any data collection or analysis of policy options, because we know these conversations are not really driven by evidence, they're driven by politics. There's a political motivation for having, not an economic motivation for having all of the Rohingya concentrated in one place. But actually, I think, I am also a bit of an optimist, like Cindy, so I think that's precisely why it's important to be collecting data and doing this analysis, that although these conversations may still be driven by politics, it's the more data and evidence we can put into them, the more likely the chance is that these conversations start to be made on the basis of evidence, and as Cindy mentioned, sort of documenting some of these experiences of how there are these win-wins, how we have seen that to be the case in very challenging settings, in places where integration has looked very difficult. Is also really important for helping to move the conversation forward. So just really a plug for saying a commendation to the team for undertaking this survey in a very difficult context, and to trying to model some of these really important policy questions, such as what are the implications of allowing Rohingya to move a bit more broadly within Bangladesh.
Thank you. Paul, a response to the questions, and then I do the final closing comment after you. We can go to closing? Okay. Then I will do in the reverse order. Closing comment beginning with Cindy, Ruth, John, and then Paul, you literally will have the final word.
It's hard. It's been such a rich discussion. I would emphasize, I do think that this evidence matters. I think there are a lot of assumptions, even at the political level, around would giving greater labor market access really be a huge pull factor? Does providing greater livelihoods actually enable people to return eventually in the future sustainably or not? So I think bringing evidence to these questions helps to ground the situation. And then the other piece is that we do recognize the reality. Some estimates which have shown that even if repatriation began tomorrow, there would still be hundreds of thousands of Rohingya in the region for the next 10 to 15 years. So I think responding to that reality and recognizing that having such a large group of people on a small plot of land without opportunities, without anything in their dwelling, that's just not a sustainable. There's not. I mean, I say win-win. I mean, that's a no-win situation, I think, and that represents a lost generation and lost opportunity that I feel, again, to acknowledge the global public good that the Bangladeshis have already provided, that it's really incumbent on the international community to step up and offer those opportunities.
Thank you. Ruth wants to yield her time to John and Paul. So, John, you're next.
Thank you, Ruth. I think what I would end is, in effect, I think a story which goes something like this. In October 2017, 700,000 extraordinarily poor people show up in another poor country. For a Washington audience to understand the magnitude of that population shift, imagine if everyone in Washington, D.C. got on the red line and showed up in Rockville. Okay, that was the magnitude of the population who leave and the magnitude, roughly speaking, of the population where they arrive. It could have gone terribly wrong. And I think Ruth is quite right to say that, in fact, there is some good news components to this story, that the humanitarian assistance system has worked well. People now have access to a very basic food basket that's allowing them to survive. But as Ruth also alluded to, it's not going to allow them to thrive. And although we don't know exactly how much is being spent on assistance, I think we all agree it's somewhere in the hundreds of millions of dollars per year. And I don't think any of us believes that that's going to go on forever. What is the single most powerful policy mechanism which would actually improve the living circumstances of these individuals? It would be allowing them to work outside the camps. Allowing them to work outside the camps, in the absence of any other form of investment, is either somewhere between bad and disastrous for the local population. So that on its own creates new problems, both economic and political. The solution is then to see, are there mechanisms or interventions which will benefit both the host population and the Rohingya? But these have to be high win-win propositions. The economic benefits to the host community need to be tangible, but they also have to be sufficiently large to overcome the government of Bangladesh's concern is that a lot of investment in this gets the government of Myanmar off the hook, right? It takes away a lot of the international pressure on the Myanmar government if it looks like the Rohingya are being taken care of. And once that happens, you then have to ask yourself, well, what other developing or developed country government would ever want to take large numbers of refugees in the future? If they know that, in fact, the long run into this is those individuals are unlikely to go back, and the country which has caused this crisis gets off the hook. So to wrap all of this up, the international assistance is working well at the moment. It's creating a window of opportunity to think about longer-term solutions. There are certainly some solutions which are on the table, but they need to be solutions which are going to benefit everyone, both the Rohingya and also the Bangladeshi host community.
Well, that was an excellent summary by John, and so I just want to touch on a few small points at the end here. Just that the government of Bangladesh, the people of Bangladesh, the donors, the NGOs really did an amazing job to be able to take in 800,000 people, like John was saying. And this happened pretty much all of a sudden. These people started pouring across the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh. And so there's a lot of room for congratulations and admiration for that effort. That's worked quite well. But there are these signs of donor fatigue, government fatigue. complaints by various groups. And so there's pressure to maybe to find some other solutions, but and we want to other solutions are necessary. We don't want one of our main purposes here is to make sure that this situation isn't simply forgotten, and these people have been sitting in the camps for already 2 years. I didn't get a chance to meet many Rohingya. I don't speak Nurul's dialect. I can speak some Bangla, but certainly not Rohingya version. But I distinctly remember a young man who had been there from one of the earlier waves who had asked, can you find some way that I can get an education? And if you think about, there are a lot of young people there that aren't getting an education. They're getting some food, but not very much. And the donors are getting a little tired. And so, yes, the Rohingya have survived. They haven't thrived. The donors and the government of Bangladesh have done a wonderful job, but we need to stay the course and find some kind of medium-term solution. And that's a choice, that's a difficult problem, but it's a choice for the Bangladesh people, for their government, and for the Rohingya themselves. So, thank you.